The Witch's Bone. Written by William Croft Dickinson. Told to you by Edward E. French. Michael Elliott, M.A., LL.D., F.S.A., Scotland, frowned at the letter which had come from the honorary curator of the local museum. It was quite a short letter and quite a simple one, merely asking him if he would allow the museum to borrow his witch's bone for a special exhibition covering folk beliefs and customs. But Michael Elliott found the letter far from welcome. Short and simple as it was, it revived and increased all the fearful troubles of his mind. More than that, dare he now let the bone pass out of his own keeping, even if only for a little while? Every day for the last week that witch's bone had preoccupied his mind to the exclusion of all else. The witch's bone that brought an end to all his quarrels with Mackenzie Grant. The witch's bone that had possibly given him a revenge far more terrible than anything he had sought or expected. In a fit of anger he had thought only of testing its efficacy, never really believing it would work. Now he knew that the bone had worked only too well. Or had it? Had he indeed compassed Grant's death? All he knew was that Grant had died, and that now he found it hard to recover his peace of mind. Of course, he had only himself to blame. He had shown the bone at the last meeting of their local antiquarian society, just after he had acquired it, and, pleased with himself, he had expatiated upon its awful power. Mackenzie Grant had contradicted him, as usual. Grant had always treated his theories with contempt. There was his paper on lake dwellings, and after that his paper on the Iron Age forts in the Central Highlands. Upon both occasions Grant had stood up and pooh-poohed everything he had said. At the meetings of the council, too, the man could be relied upon to speak against everything he proposed. But all that was past history. Grant had poured scorn upon his story of the bone, and now Grant was dead. Yet how unbounded would be the relief of his tortured mind if Grant had been right, and if the story of the bone were stuff and nonsense and nothing more. The very night that Grant had ridiculed his story, he had put the bone to the test, directing its malevolent powers against Mackenzie Grant, and Grant had died a horrible death a few hours later. But could it not have been a ghastly coincidence in which the bone had played no part at all? It was only a short piece of bone, probably sheep bone, about 6 inches long, with a narrow ring of black bog oak tightly encircling it near its center. He had acquired it during his recent holiday in Sutherland. An old woman had died in a remote glen, and because she had been reputed to be a witch, and had been feared as such, no one would bear her to burial. The local minister had called upon him, beseeching his help. The poor body was no witch at all, the minister had said. She was just old and ill-favored. I've had a coffin made about the right size. At any rate, it will be large enough, and if you could just drive me to the old body's hut with the coffin in the rear of your estate wagon, maybe we could manage to coffin her and give her a Christian burial. A strange request to make of any man. But the minister had won him over, and his reward had been the witch's bone. They had found it on a shelf in the old woman's hut. The minister had seen it first, and had prodded it gently with his finger. So, he said softly, the witch's bone. I've been told of it. There are those of my people who say that she would utter a curse upon some man or woman, and then would make a wax figure and stick a pin into it. Then they say that if this bone rattled on its shelf, she knew that her curse had taken effect, and that the person portrayed in the wax would be seized with pains in that part of the body which corresponded with the place of the pin in the wax. Some have even said that she could kill by sticking her pin in the heart or the head, for the power is in the bone. It can wound or kill any who are cursed by its possessor, and never are they spared. He had listened and looked with astonishment until suddenly the minister's face had changed, and he had cried out, "But what am I saying to you? There is no witch of Endor in Sutherland. Indeed there is not. No such devilry is possible. I'm not believing one word of it." And the minister had boldly picked up the bone and offered it to him. "Take it with you," he had said. "It may interest some of your friends in the South." And, wondering, he had taken it. Yes, it had interested some of his friends, but Mackenzie Grant had laughed at him. "A witch's bone," he had said contemptuously. "Stuff and nonsense. Anyone can see, by just looking at it, that it's a handle and nothing more. That ring round its center simply means that when it is grasped, 2 fingers go on one side of the ring and 2 fingers on the other. Any boy flying a kite grasps a piece of wood in exactly the same way at the end of his string. Witch's bone, indeed. I believe, Eliot, I could persuade you that a handkerchief with a hole in it is a witch's veil to be worn at meetings of her coven, and the hole, of course, would be symbolic, indicative of her lapse from the Christian faith." And so the man had gone on, laughing at him before his friends. He had kept down the anger which had surged within him, but when he had returned home and had taken the bone from his pocket, all his pent-up feelings had broken their bounds. He had marched straight into his study and, placing the bone upon a bookshelf near the fireplace, had resolved to prove its power to hurt. Aloud and deliberately he had cursed Mackenzie Grant, but searching for sealing wax could find none. Then he had recalled the photograph of Mackenzie Grant in a recent volume of the Transactions of their Society. He had recalled, too, his aversion to destroying any photograph. To tear up a photograph had always seemed to him to be akin to tearing the living flesh and bones. So much the better. Mackenzie Grant should be torn asunder with a vengeance. He had ripped the full-page photograph from the book and had deliberately torn it to pieces. In the fury of his task he had, for the moment, forgotten the bone, but as the torn pieces had multiplied between his hands, suddenly there had come a rattling sound from the nearby shelf, and at that his heart had turned to ice. Fearfully he had looked at the bone. It lay exactly where he had placed it. It lay inert and still. He remembered assuring himself that he had simply imagined that rattle. He was overwrought. Yes, it was imagination and nothing more. Yet the next morning, when reading The Scotsman at breakfast time, again a chill had struck his heart, and his whole body was numbed with fear. For the paper announced with regret that a distinguished antiquary, Mr. Mackenzie Grant, had been killed in a road accident. According to the announcement, Mr. Grant, when driving home about midnight, after having dined with a friend, had unaccountably run head-on into a heavy lorry that had stopped for some minor adjustment on the opposite side of the road. It was a bad accident. Grant's car had been completely telescoped. But, in the opinion of the doctors, he must have been killed instantaneously, for their examination showed that he had suffered multiple injuries and that practically every bone in his body was broken. No wonder his mind was ill at ease. He had striven to persuade himself that it was pure coincidence, that those multiple injuries had naught to do with a photograph torn into many shreds. He had labored to free himself from a haunting burden of guilt. Yet the torturing thought was still there. Had the bone indeed the power of killing those who were cursed by its possessor? Since then he had locked it up in his coin cabinet. He had even been afraid to open the cabinet to make certain it was still there. Now the museum had asked to be allowed to borrow it, to put it on display. To say that he had lost it, or had destroyed it, would be childish. Yet dare he lend it? Dare he allow it to pass out of his own keeping? These were but some of the thoughts that troubled the mind of Dr. Michael Eliot as he sat with a letter that lay before him on his desk. About 9 o'clock in the evening of the same day, when Sir Stephen Rowinson, C.I.E., the honorary curator of the museum, was deep in a detective story, his housekeeper knocked on his study door and announced, "Dr. Michael Eliot." Somewhat surprised, Rowinson put down his book and rose to greet his visitor. "Come in, Eliot. Come in. This is an unexpected pleasure." Michael Elliot entered the room slowly and hesitantly. "Man, but you do look tired," continued Rowanson, as Elliot came into the light. "It's these cold nights. Take that chair by the fire and warm yourself. I'll get you a whiskey." Elliot took the proffered chair and sank down into it. If indeed he was looking tired, he knew full well that it was not due to the coldness of the night. "I've called about your letter asking for the loan of my witch's bone," he said, turning to his host and gratefully accepting the whiskey which had been poured out for him. I thought I'd sooner bring it to you personally at your home, rather than give it to you or leave it for you at the museum." "Why?" "Certainly," replied Rowanson, concealing his surprise. "You think I might possibly leave it lying about in the museum and it might fall into the wrong hands?" Rowanson spoke with a smile, but Elliot colored slightly. "You have guessed correctly. It may be more dangerous than we know." Rowanson looked more closely at his visitor. Did Elliot really believe that this bit of bone could exert occult force? He had been one of those standing by when Mackenzie Grant had poured his scorn upon it, and although he had not heard Elliot's account of its supposed malignant power, he knew full well that the man was apt to be too credulous. But perhaps he had better humor him. "You are right," he conceded gravely. "I've seen some strange things myself, in India. We must be careful. Would it make you happier if I promised that when I do put it on display, I will put it in a locked case?" Elliot's relief was too apparent to be disguised. "I was hoping for something like that," he said, taking the bone from his breast pocket. "It is good of you to go to so much trouble, but I should feel reassured if it was under lock and key." "You can rely on me," returned Rowanson. "I will keep it safely here in the house until I have a locked case ready for it. And I will tell no one it is here." Once more, Elliot's relief was so obvious that Rowanson, taking the bone from him, ostentatiously looked about his study for a safe keeping place. Not finding one, he placed the bone on his desk. "I'll find a safe place for it later," he assured Elliot. "You can rely on me. And I will certainly keep it here until I take it personally to the museum and myself place it in a display case that can be securely locked." Thereafter, for some 10 minutes or so, Sir Stephen Rowanson strove in vain to find some topic of conversation which would interest his visitor, but Elliot answered only in monosyllables, while his eyes constantly strayed to the witch's bone lying on the curator's desk, and his only thought was whether he should warn Rowanson of its dangerous power, or whether that would merely make him look foolish and at the same time make Rowanson less responsive and also more careless. "Well," said Rowanson, as he wearied of his task, "I mustn't keep you too late. And don't worry about your bone. It will be quite safe." Elliot rose heavily to his feet. "Thank you," he said. "I'm sorry to be so fussy, but, you know, I do believe it may be a witch's bone, and not as Mackenzie Grant maintained, simply a handle of some kind." The last words had come out with difficulty, and Rowanson thought he understood. "Yes, poor fellow. We shall miss his skeptical comments. We were all his victims at one time or another." Elliot winced. Again his eyes strayed to the witch's bone. "You won't leave it there, will you?" he asked. "No, no," replied Rowanson quickly. "I'll find a safe place for it all right." Seemingly reassured, Elliot moved towards the door of the room. Rowanson opened it and, conducting his visitor through the hall, led him out of the house. For a minute or two he watched the retreating figure. "There goes one of the most distinguished classical scholars in Europe," he said to himself, "and yet with more antiquarian bees in his bonnet than any man I know." A witch's bone, indeed. It may be, but even so, what harm can it do to anyone? He returned to his study and, picking up the bone from his desk, examined it under the reading lamp, but his examination made him no wiser. Well, well, old Elliot was certainly mighty concerned about it, and I'd better do what I said. But where shall I put the wretched thing? I haven't a safe, and there isn't a drawer in the whole house that would defeat a 10-year-old. Moving about the room with the bone in his hand, Rowanson finally stopped in front of an old-fashioned knick-knack stand which bore on its shelves a medley of flints, cylindrical seals, Roman nails, and other small archaeological objects of varying periods and kinds. "The very place," he muttered, not so much Poe's idea in the purloined letter as Chesterton's idea of hiding a leaf in a forest. By moving some of the specimens closer to one another, he cleared a small space on one of the shelves and placed the bone there. Stepping back, he surveyed the results and found it good. 2 days later, Sir Stephen Rowanson entered his study after a frugal breakfast. He was feeling thoroughly disgruntled. His housekeeper, summoned yesterday afternoon to nurse a sister who had suddenly been taken ill, had left him to fend for himself. And Sir Stephen Rowanson was not accustomed to domestic work. He had managed to prepare his coffee, toast, and marmalade for breakfast, and now the dead ashes in his study fireplace mocked him. He would have to take out those ashes and lay the fire himself. Unwillingly he began his task, and as he busied himself with paper and firewood, his mind turned to the museum and to its forthcoming exhibition, and his thoughts made him more disgruntled still. Why should everything go wrong at one and the same time? For yesterday morning, when 1 or 2 members of the society had come to the museum to help with the final preparations, and when, in accordance with his promise, he had arranged for a place in one of the 2 locked cases to be reserved for Michael Elliott's witch's bone, the interfering and officious Colonel Hogan had actually presumed to give contrary orders, even asserting that the bone wasn't worth a place in the exhibition anywhere. He had had trouble with the colonel before. The man seemed to think he was in command of everything, but this time there had followed an unseemly wrangle in which he had completely lost his temper. More than that, he had hotly argued that the bone might be more dangerous than any of them realized. That heated altercation had made him look foolish, and he remembered, to his annoyance, the glances that had been exchanged. The word would now go round that he was becoming as credulous as Elliot himself. But if Elliot hadn't been so fussy, the argument would never have started at all. "I could curse the old fool," he muttered angrily, as he thrust the sticks of firewood among the paper which he had crushed up and laid in the hearth. "Damn Michael Elliot, and damn his bone." He finished laying the fire and rose up from his task when, as he did so, he heard a strange rattle which seemed to come from somewhere within the room. Startled, he looked round, but nothing had fallen, nothing seemed to be out of place. "Probably a bird fluttered against the window," he said dubiously. But it didn't sound like it. It was a queer sound. Never heard anything like it before. Well, what now? He could go to the museum and work there, then he could lunch at his club, back to the museum again, dinner at the club, and perhaps he could even collect together a bridge for the evening. Yes, he could manage without his housekeeper for a day or 2, but he hoped it wouldn't be longer. Everything had worked according to plan, and Sir Stephen Rowanson was feeling much happier. He had put in a good morning's work, he had had an excellent lunch at his club, and had even arranged a bridge for. He had carried on with his exhibition in the afternoon, and to his great relief, the members who had dropped in to help had given no indication that yesterday's wrangle had affected them in any way at all. It was nearly 5 o'clock, and he was thinking of giving up for the day, when he heard the bell ring. That was unusual. Who could be ringing the bell? The door was open, and people just walked in. Somewhat puzzled, he went to the door and found there a young man. "Sir Stephen Rowanson?" "Yes." "My name is Robert Reed, sir. You won't know me, but I'm the local representative of the Scotsman, and I was told you might be able to help me." Sir Stephen Rowanson led his visitor into the main room of the museum. "And what can I do to help you?" he asked. "I'm anxious to trace a photograph of Dr. Michael Elliot. The paper wishes to carry one tomorrow. I do not like to call at his house, and it was suggested to me that probably you would have one here since, or so I gather, Dr. Elliot was a prominent member of your society. But why can't you call at his house? The young man looked up quickly. But of course, how stupid of me. You cannot have heard. Then in a slightly lower voice he continued, I'm very sorry to tell you, sir, that Dr. Michael Elliot is dead. He was killed in a bad accident in Edinburgh about 11:30 this morning, and as you will understand, we must carry a fairly long obituary notice. We would also like a photograph, if possible. Michael Elliot dead? Repeated Rowanson dully. Yes, sir. Apparently he was walking along the pavement by a site where a new building was going up when, for some reason, a steel girder that was being lifted by a crane slipped from the chains which were holding it. Hitting the side of the building, it slewed round and, by sheer bad luck, fell on Dr. Elliot and crushed him to death. How horrible! Yes, sir, but we are told that death must have been instantaneous, for not only was Dr. Elliot badly crushed, but also the girder, in falling, broke down a wooden screen which was shielding the site and, according to the doctors, drove a wedge of broken wood from the screen straight through Dr. Elliot's heart. For a brief space, Sir Stephen Rowanson remained silent. It comes to all of us sooner or later, he said at last. But I wish it could have come in a way different from this. A photograph. Yes, I think I can help. There was a photograph of Dr. Elliot in our local paper, The Standard, only the other day. Come up to my house and I'll show it to you. Then, if you think it's suitable, I'm sure the Standard people will be only too glad to lend you the block. Sir Stephen Rowanson led the newspaper man into his study, where, almost at once, he apologized for the coldness of the room. I'm sorry to offer you such a chilly reception, he said, but my housekeeper is away and I am looking after myself. However, we'll soon have a fire, and then I'll hunt for that photograph. Although the young man held out a restraining hand, Rowanson struck a match and lit the fire. Then, crossing to a pile of newspapers on a small table by his desk, he began to turn over the papers one by one. But the Standard, which he wanted, was not there. Queer, he said. I could have sworn it was in this pile. But warm yourself at what fire there is while I have a look in the dining room. I sometimes leave the paper there. He went out of the room, and the young man looked ruefully at the fire. The edges of the paper had burned, but nothing more. As one last wisp of smoke curled up towards the chimney, the fire was out. I can't find it anywhere, growled Rowanson, coming back into the room. Once more he went through the pile of papers on the table, and still without success. Then he saw the dead hearth. Oh, I am sorry, he cried. The fire has gone out. I must have packed it too tightly. Stupid of me, but it's years since I laid a fire. Then a new thought came to him. And I'm willing to bet that the Standard I'm looking for is there, at the bottom of my wretched fire. I just took the first paper that came to hand. I really am sorry, but look, if you go to the offices of the Standard in the High Street, they'll willingly show you the issue, and then you can ask about the block. Say I sent you. Really, I should have taken you there in the first place. With many apologies for troubling the honorary curator of the museum, the young newspaper man left. Sir Stephen Rowanson returned to his study, and there looked balefully at the dead fire. I suppose I shall have to relay the damned thing, he muttered to himself. I'd better do it now and have it done with. Kneeling down in front of the hearth, he removed the coal, then the firewood, and finally the paper. Yes, he had packed it too tightly, but he had learned his lesson. Straightening out a piece of the crushed paper, he saw it was the Standard for which he had been looking. He might have guessed that he would use the one newspaper that was wanted. Ah, here was the page that bore poor Elliot's photograph. He straightened the page. It was still a good likeness, even though the photograph was badly crushed, and a splinter from the rough firewood had pierced in its very heart. But all that held no significance for Sir Stephen Rowanson. he relayed the fire, went to his bathroom, and there washed his hands.